Story 1. Don't answer the door. It was a stormy night when Lena heard the first knock at her front door. She lived alone in a small house at the edge of town, surrounded by woods. The rain was coming down in sheets and the wind howled against the windows. The clock read 11:47 p.m. Who could it be at this hour? She muttered, pulling her blanket tighter around her. The knock came again, louder this time. She hesitated, debating whether to answer. Peeking through the peephole, she saw nothing but darkness. Another knock, harder. "Hello?" she called through the door. No response. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, and she picked it up to see a text message from an unknown number. "Don't open the door. Whatever you do, don't open it." Lena's blood ran cold. She looked back at the door. The knocks had stopped, replaced by a strange scraping sound, like nails dragging across the wood. Another text came through. "It wants to come in. Don't let it." She backed away from the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The scraping turned to banging, heavy and desperate. "Who's there?" she shouted, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The banging stopped. Then came a voice, soft and familiar. "Lena, it's me. Let me in." Her breath caught in her throat. It was her sister's voice. But that was impossible. Her sister had died 3 years ago in a car accident. The voice came again, more insistent. "Lena, please, I'm cold. Let me in." Her phone buzzed again. "It's lying. Don't listen." Tears streamed down Lena's face as she backed into the living room. The banging resumed, louder and more violent than before. The wall shook with each hit. Then, suddenly, it stopped. Lena waited, holding her breath, until she heard footsteps walking away from the door. But as she turned to sit down, she froze. A wet, bloody handprint was smeared on the inside of her living room window. Story 2. The Ghost in the Static. When Claire moved into her new apartment, the first thing she noticed was the old, bulky TV in the living room. It was the kind of boxy television no one used anymore, but it was mounted to the wall, and removing it would have been a hassle. She decided to leave it alone. The first night in the apartment was uneventful, but as Claire was unpacking the next evening, the TV turned on by itself. She jumped, startled by the sudden burst of static filling the room. Grabbing the remote, she tried to turn it off, but the screen flickered. For a moment, she thought she saw a face in the static, a pale, twisted face with hollow eyes and an open mouth. The screen went dark, and Claire dismissed it as her imagination. Over the next few days, the TV turned on randomly, always to static. Once, she heard whispers in the noise, faint and unintelligible, but undeniably there. Late one night, as she was lying in bed, the TV came on again. This time, the static wasn't just static. Shapes moved across the screen, shadowy figures, reaching toward the glass. One of them stopped, its face pressing against the inside of the screen. Its mouth moved, forming words Claire couldn't hear. The remote didn't work. The power button didn't work. "Leave," the figure finally said, its voice crackling through the speakers. The screen shattered. Claire fled the apartment that night and never returned. Story 3. The Midnight Radio Station. Jason loved driving at night. The empty highways, the hum of the engine, and the solitude always helped him clear his mind. One night, while driving home from a business trip, he found himself on a long stretch of road that was completely desolate. The clock on his dashboard read 2:37 a.m., and his phone had no signal. He fiddled with the car radio to fill the silence, but every station was static. He twisted the knob slowly, searching for anything: music, news, even a weather report. Finally, at 107.6 FM, he heard a crackling voice. "And now, we'll take you back to the midnight hour." Jason frowned. The voice was distorted, like an old recording being played on a scratched vinyl. But he was intrigued. The voice continued, sounding almost amused. "You're listening to Station 107.6 for those who've lost their way." Jason chuckled nervously. "Weird tagline," he muttered. Then a song started to play. It was an old, haunting melody, something he couldn't quite place. The lyrics were strange, almost nonsensical, but the tune wormed its way into his head. As he drove, the headlights illuminated an odd figure standing on the side of the road. Jason slowed down. The figure, a woman in a torn dress, stood perfectly still, staring at his car with her head tilted unnaturally to one side. The radio voice spoke again. "Don't stop. Whatever you do, keep driving." Jason froze. His hand hovered over the brake, but something about the voice sent a chill down his spine. He sped up instead, glancing in the rearview mirror. The woman hadn't moved, but she was still watching him. As he drove on, the radio signal became clearer. The station began to list names. Jason's blood ran cold when he heard his own name and description. Jason Collins, male, late 30s, driving a silver sedan, destination unknown. He turned the radio off, but the moment he did, the static came back. A voice whispered from the speakers, though the radio was off. "You shouldn't have turned me off, Jason." His knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. The song returned, louder this time, drowning out his thoughts. The shadows outside the car seemed to move closer, twisting into impossible shapes. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the static stopped. The road ahead was clear, the shadows gone. His phone buzzed, finally back in range. Jason never found 107.6 FM again, no matter how hard he tried. But every so often, late at night, he swore he could hear that haunting melody in the back of his mind. Story 4. The room that shouldn't exist. Sam was thrilled when he finally moved into his first apartment. It was nothing fancy, a one-bedroom unit on the 4th floor of an old building downtown. The rent was cheap, and the view from his small balcony overlooked the bustling city below. As he unpacked and explored the apartment, he noticed something peculiar. His bedroom had a closet door on the left wall, but it didn't seem to open. The door was painted shut, and no matter how hard he pushed or pulled, it wouldn't budge. When Sam asked the landlord about it, the man looked uncomfortable. "That door hasn't been opened in years," he said, quickly changing the subject. Curiosity got the better of Sam. That evening, armed with a crowbar, he pried the door open. It took effort, but eventually the wood splintered and the door creaked open. Behind it was a small, dimly lit room. The walls were bare and the floor was covered in dust. There was no furniture, no windows, just a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. At first, Sam thought it was just an old storage space, but as he stepped inside, a shiver ran down his spine. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and he felt like he was being watched. Shrugging off the feeling, he cleaned out the room and decided to use it as a storage space. He moved in some boxes and forgot about it. But that night, Sam woke up to the sound of whispers. He sat up in bed, heart pounding, and strained to listen. The whispers were faint, muffled, and seemed to be coming from the closet. He got out of bed, turned on the light, and opened the door. The small room was empty, but the air was colder than before. The whispers grew louder over the next few nights, always coming from the room. At times, they sounded like multiple voices murmuring over each other. One night, Sam decided to leave the door open while he slept. He placed a camera on his nightstand, aimed it at the room, and left it recording. The next morning, he played back the footage. At first, there was nothing, just hours of stillness and silence. But then, around 3 a.m., the camera caught movement. A shadow moved across the room, slow and deliberate. It wasn't human. The shape was wrong, twisted and angular, like something crawling on all fours. The shadow disappeared into the closet's darkness. Sam moved out the next day, but wherever he went, he swore he could still hear the whispers at night, calling his name. Story 5. The Faces in the Photos. Mark loved photography. His weekends were often spent exploring abandoned buildings, snapping photos of peeling wallpaper, rusted machinery, and graffiti-covered walls. One weekend, he came across an old, dilapidated hospital on the edge of town. The building was massive, with shattered windows and hallways swallowed by darkness. He knew it was dangerous, but he couldn't resist. As he explored the crumbling halls, he felt uneasy. The air was damp, and the sound of his footsteps echoed unnaturally. But nothing seemed out of the ordinary, so he continued taking pictures. It wasn't until he got home and uploaded the photos to his computer that he noticed something strange. In one photo, taken in a long hallway, he saw a shadowy figure at the far end. It was faint, almost transparent, but unmistakably human. In another photo, taken in an old patient room, a face stared back at him from the broken mirror. It wasn't his reflection. Mark told himself it was just a trick of the light, an effect of dust and shadows. But as he reviewed more photos, the figures became clearer. A woman in a hospital gown, standing in the corner of a room, a man with hollow eyes peering through a shattered window. By the time he reached the last photo, his hands were shaking. It was a selfie he had taken in the hospital lobby. Behind him, standing just inches away, was a man in a black suit, his face pale and featureless. Mark deleted the photos and swore never to return to the hospital. But the figures didn't stay in the photos. That night, as Mark lay in bed, he heard footsteps in his room. When he opened his eyes, the man in the black suit was standing over him.